Chapter 1. The Boy Who Spoke of Dragons. In the mist-wrapped valleys of Ionia, where the air was always thick with the scent of cherry blossoms and the hum of cicadas carried from field to field, a boy made his way up the mountain path to the Shojin monastery. The climb was long, the steps uneven and ancient, carved by generations of monks whose devotion had worn grooves into the stone. For most children, the journey alone would have been enough to break their resolve. Many who came to Shojin did so at the urging of their families, sent in hopes that the discipline of the monastery would mold them into humble servants of the divine. These children would arrive weary, trembling under the weight of their own uncertainty, and bow their heads deeply before the monks at the gate. But this boy came differently. His back was straight, his gaze direct, and though his frame was slight with youth, his presence seemed to press against the calm of the place. When the great wooden doors of Shojin opened and the monks asked him what brought him to their sacred ground, he looked directly into the eyes of the elder at the gate and spoke words that none had ever heard from a child before. "The dragon spirit has chosen me," he said. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no childish tremor in his voice. It was a statement, a declaration, delivered with such certainty that the monks could not simply laugh it away. Some frowned, others exchanged puzzled glances, and a few chuckled softly under their breath. It was not uncommon for the young to speak boldly of destiny, to imagine themselves heroes before the work of humility had even begun. Yet there was something unsettling in the way this boy said it. He spoke not like one who hoped, but like one who already knew. His name was LEESIN. Shojin was a place of silence and order, perched high among cliffs that disappeared into the embrace of drifting clouds. The students there lived lives that were stripped of ornament. They rose before dawn to the sound of the gong echoing through the halls, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. They meditated first, seated in stillness as the sun crept across the horizon, and only after this stillness came the training of the body. They practiced stances on narrow ledges, balanced buckets of water on aching arms, and carried stones up the steep steps of the monastery to temper their endurance. After training came chores, cleaning halls, repairing roofs, tending to the temple gardens. Day after day, the cycle repeated, forging patience as much as it forged strength. LEESIN adapted quickly, though not in the way the monks desired. From the first days of training, he showed a sharpness beyond his years. Where other boys faltered under the strain of carrying water up hundreds of steps, he endured. Where others trembled on narrow ledges, he steadied himself with ease. His strikes landed harder, his kicks faster, his body lean but already honed for the life of a warrior. His instructors saw in him something undeniable, a potential that could not be ignored. Yet they also saw in him something dangerous. For every victory in training brought him not humility but pride. Where his peers sought peace in meditation, he squirmed in impatience. While they emptied their minds in stillness, his thoughts raced ahead to contests of strength, to dreams of surpassing those around him. The monks reminded him constantly that strength without discipline was like fire without a hearth. It would consume everything around it. But LEESIN only half listened. At night, when the monastery grew quiet and the candles burned low in the archives, his hunger for power drove him further still. He crept into forbidden halls where scrolls whispered of the spirit realm, where stories of dragons were not told as myths, but as truths. There he read of ancient summoners who had called upon the essence of beings beyond comprehension, men and women who had struck with fire, who had shaken the very earth, who had commanded the winds. Each line he read only deepened the spark of arrogance already alive within him. If the dragon had indeed chosen him, as he had boldly declared at the gates, then surely these arts belonged to him. Why should he wait years for recognition? Why should he bow and scrape through endless chores when his destiny was already certain? His instructors saw the restlessness growing in him. They urged caution, reminded him that the search for power without wisdom was a path to ruin. Some even warned him directly, telling him stories of those who had sought mastery before their spirits were ready. and had been destroyed by their own ambition. But LEESIN nodded distractedly, always polite to their faces, while in his heart he dismissed their warnings as lessons for lesser men. He was not like the others. He was chosen. The other initiates watched him with awe and unease. They saw how he trained twice as long as they did, how he forced himself past exhaustion and bruises, how he seemed to rise every morning with the same fire burning in his chest. Some admired him, seeing in him proof that greatness was possible. Others feared him, sensing the sharpness of his ambition, the way he seemed to walk not alongside them but ahead of them, always ahead. He sparred with a ferocity that left his peers gasping on the ground, and when he won, as he always did, there was a faint smile on his lips that spoke not of satisfaction, but of expectation. In his mind, victory was his birthright. The elders of Shojin debated often about him. Some saw promise in his strength and believed that with patience he could be tempered. Others feared that his fire would only grow until it consumed him, and perhaps the monastery itself. Yet even they could not deny his skill, and so he advanced through the ranks with ease, passing every trial, surpassing every challenge. Where others hesitated, he moved. Where others fell, he stood. His progress was undeniable, and yet with each success his humility slipped further from his grasp. Still, there were moments when doubt flickered within him. He alone at night, staring into the shadows of his chamber, he sometimes wondered if the dragon had truly chosen him, or if he had simply chosen himself. But those moments were brief, quickly smothered by the echo of his own certainty. Every strike of his fists, every whispered rumor of his talent, every stolen glance at the scrolls of forbidden knowledge seemed to confirm his belief that he was destined for more. Thus the boy who spoke of dragons grew into a youth whose fire burned brighter than the rest, untempered by humility, unsoftened by patience. He was brilliant, but he was reckless. He was gifted, but he was arrogant. And all who saw him knew, whether they admitted it or not, that this fire, if left unchecked, would one day burst forth in a blaze that no one could control. Chapter 2. Seeds of Arrogance. As seasons turned over the mountain, and the blossoms of spring gave way to the storms of summer, LEESIN's legend within the walls of Shojin began to grow. He was no longer the uncertain boy at the gates, claiming that destiny had whispered his name. He was becoming something else, a youth who dominated every test, who answered every challenge with the certainty of one who believed himself already chosen. His fists were like iron, his kicks like crashing waves, and his endurance seemed without limit. Every dawn he rose before the gong, and every night he trained long after the others had collapsed into exhausted sleep. He carried stones up the temple steps until his shoulders bled, balanced on the narrowest beams until his toes cramped, and struck the practice dummies until the wood splintered under the force. The monks saw his hunger and admired his dedication, but behind their calm eyes lingered worry. It was not only discipline that drove him, it was ambition, sharp and restless as a blade without a sheath. Meditation remained his weakness. The other initiates would sit cross-legged in the gardens for hours, the wind rustling the leaves around them as they tried to dissolve the boundaries of body and spirit. LEESIN, though he sat with them, could never quiet the roar in his mind. He shifted, he clenched his jaw, he tapped his fingers against his knees. His thoughts would drift to sparring matches, to the next test, to the feel of power thrumming in his muscles. The elders would remind him that stillness was as important as strength, that to master the spirit was greater than mastering the fist. He would bow respectfully, eyes lowered, but in his heart he felt their lessons were chains meant to bind him, to hold him back from the destiny he knew was his. In the quiet hours of night, when the monastery's halls glowed faintly with the light of oil lamps, he returned to the archives. The forbidden scrolls called to him, and though he knew the risk, he could not resist. There he learned of the dragon's flame, of the ancient monks who had dared to channel its essence into their own bodies, transforming themselves into living weapons of destruction and transcendence. The word struck him with awe. Dragons were not metaphors. not distant myths, but spirits as real as the ground beneath his feet, to summon their fire, to wield their essence. That was the path of true greatness. That was what it meant to be chosen. LEESIN began to practice in secret. When the others slept, he stood in the courtyards, eyes fixed on the moon above the peaks, and he tried to feel the fire that the scrolls described. He breathed deeply, calling his chid into his limbs, willing it to ignite into something greater. Sometimes he felt only frustration, but at other times there was something, an echo, a warmth in his chest, a flicker that made him certain he was drawing closer. The more he felt it, the more he believed. The whispers of doubt that had once crept into his mind were drowned beneath the certainty that the dragon's flame had already begun to answer him. The other initiates noticed the change. They saw how he struck harder than before, how he moved faster, how his presence seemed almost too much for the practice halls to contain. They began to look at him differently, some with admiration, others with jealousy, and a few with fear. He was no longer just one among them. He was something apart, something above. Their instructors noticed it too. The masters of Shojin spoke among themselves of the danger. Some believed he was destined for greatness, that the fire within him was proof that the spirits had chosen him as he claimed. Others argued that fire without control would only destroy, that his ambition was a shadow growing darker with every passing year. Yet for all their debates, they could not deny his progress. He surpassed every trial, passed every test, and where others struggled, he excelled. To hold him back seemed impossible, even unfair. So he advanced higher and higher, until no one within the monastery could match him. But strength brought arrogance. In sparring matches, he no longer fought to learn but to dominate. When he won, which was almost always, he offered his hand to help his opponent rise. But the gesture was not born of kindness. It was born of superiority, a reminder of the gulf between them. When he trained not to refine but to conquer, to push his body beyond every limit, as if mastery lay only in excess. His peers began to whisper that he was not like them, that perhaps the dragon truly had chosen him. The whispers fueled him, and he fed on them like fire fed on dry wood. Still, the elders tried to guide him. One master in particular, an old monk with a back bent by years of discipline, took him aside after training. He told LEESIN that his strength was undeniable, but strength alone was never the answer. He told him that arrogance was a poison, that if he did not learn balance, he would one day destroy not only himself, but those around him. LEESIN bowed deeply, masking his impatience, and thanked the master for his wisdom. But in his heart, the warning only deepened his belief that the old feared the young, that they saw in him a power they could not control, and so cloaked their fear in lessons about restraint. The truth was that restraint no longer mattered to him. Each night, when he stood in the courtyard beneath the stars, he felt the flicker of the dragon growing brighter. Each breath seemed to carry him closer to summoning its essence, each strike to awaken its fire, and with every step his certainty grew. He was not just another monk in training. He was not bound by their rules, their fears, their limits. He was chosen, he was destined, and soon the world would see it. But destiny, as the monks had tried to teach him, is not always kind. Seeds of arrogance grow quickly in fertile soil, but they are shallow roots, and the storm that tears through them always comes. LEESIN, though he could not yet see it, was walking toward that storm, each step carrying him closer to the moment when his pride would ignite, when the dragon's fire would answer his call, not with glory, but with ruin. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Strike. The day began like any other. The gong rang at dawn, echoing through the mountains, pulling the initiates from their mats and into the cold embrace of the morning air. They filed into the courtyard, their breaths rising in misty trails as the sun crept above the horizon. They bowed to their instructors, repeated the chants of discipline, and began the slow, practiced movements of their daily routines. To the others, it was a cycle as endless as the seasons. but to LEESIN it was a stage. Every morning was another chance to show that he was different, that he was destined. The other boys moved with care, focusing on precision, on aligning their breaths with each strike. LEESIN moved with force. His punches cracked against the wooden dummies. His kicks thudded with a power that turned heads, and each movement carried the restless edge of a storm. That morning, as he struck again and again, he felt the flicker in his chest stronger than ever, the fire of the dragon pushing against the walls of his body. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The elders had warned him many times. The archives were forbidden for good reason, the knowledge inside too dangerous for the unprepared. But LEESIN had read every scroll he could find, committing each line to memory. He knew the stance. He knew the breath. He knew the words that would open the path between his chi and the spirit realm. And more than that, he believed with every fiber of his being that he was ready. As the drills ended and the initiates paired off for sparring, LEESIN's gaze drifted toward the master who oversaw the training. The old man had taught him since the beginning, correcting his stances, chastising his arrogance, trying to instill humility into a boy who had none. LEESIN looked at him now, not as a teacher, but as the one who would witness the proof of his destiny. When his turn came, LEESIN stepped into the circle. His opponent bowed, but LEESIN barely acknowledged him. His eyes were on the master, his fists clenched, his heart raced, and deep within him the dragon's flame pulsed, waiting to be released. He struck a pose, steadying his breath. The courtyard grew still. The other initiates, sensing something unusual, lowered their voices and watched. Even the master furrowed his brow, uneasy at the boy's intensity. Then LEESIN moved. His heel whipped forward in a blur. His breath exploded from his lungs, and the words of the forbidden incantation burst from his lips. The air cracked. A shockwave of fire and force erupted from his body, slamming into the ground with the sound of thunder. The courtyard shuddered, dust and stone flying as the earth itself seemed to cry out. The power was overwhelming, too much for a boy's body to contain, too wild to be controlled. For a moment, LEESIN felt elation. He had done it. He had summoned the dragon's might, but the fire did not strike where he intended. It lashed outward like a whip, and when the smoke cleared, silence fell. The master lay on the ground, unmoving, his body broken. His spine had been shattered by the force, his life forever crippled in an instant. The courtyard froze. The initiates stared in horror, their admiration for LEESIN collapsing into fear. The old man who had guided them, who had given his life to the discipline of Shojin, lay broken not by an enemy, but by one of their own. LEESIN's chest heaved as he realized what he had done. The fire inside him that moments before had felt like glory now burned like shame. He dropped to his knees beside his master, his hands trembling, but there was no undoing what had been unleashed. The damage was irreversible. The dragon's flame had answered, but it had not blessed him. It had condemned him. The elders convened that evening. The council chamber was heavy with incense, but no fragrance could cover the weight of their grief. Some argued that LEESIN was too dangerous to remain, that exile was the only choice. Others, their voices softer, argued that he was still a child, that his arrogance had blinded him but not yet destroyed him. In the end, they agreed on one truth. The monastery could no longer be his home. He had broken their laws, ignored their warnings, and brought ruin upon one of their most respected masters. No amount of skill could erase that sin. When the sentence was delivered, LEESIN bowed his head. For the first time, he did not argue. He did not boast of destiny or claim to be chosen. The sight of his teacher, now confined to a chair for the rest of his life, had silenced even his pride. Exile was a punishment, but it was also mercy. He accepted it, though the acceptance felt hollow. The boy who had once declared himself the vessel of the dragon now walked down the mountain path with nothing but the clothes on his back, the weight of his failure pressing on his shoulders, heavier than any stone he had ever carried. The villagers he passed looked at him with curiosity, some with suspicion. To them he was just another monk cast out from the monastery, another failure in robes too fine for the shame he carried. But to LEESIN, every step away from Shojin felt like a step into darkness. The silence that once filled his heart with fire now echoed with guilt. He had wanted to prove his greatness, to show the world that he was chosen, but instead he had proven his arrogance, and it had cost him everything. Nights on the road were long. He slept under trees, beside streams, with only the sounds of the wild for company. He thought of his peers, still training in the monastery's courtyards, still learning the lessons he had rejected. He thought of his master, broken because of his pride. He thought of the dragon, the spirit he believed had chosen him, and wondered if it had ever been true, or perhaps it had been nothing but the whispers of his own ego. Yet even in exile, the fire did not leave him. It flickered still, low but persistent, reminding him with every breath that his journey was not over. He was marked, scarred by his failure, but not destroyed. Somewhere in the distance, he told himself, there would be a chance to atone, but atonement would not come quickly, nor easily. He was no longer the boy who spoke of dragons. He was something else now, something broken, something lost. And as the road stretched endlessly before him, he knew that the path to redemption would be far longer than the path that had led him to ruin. Chapter 4. The Wanderer of Ionia. Exile is a word that cuts deeper than a blade. When the gates of Shojin closed behind LEESIN, he did not feel the relief of freedom, but the weight of absence. The chants of the monks, the ring of the gong, the smell of incense drifting through carved wooden halls. These had been his world since boyhood. Now there was only the road, and the road had no voice, no patience, no forgiveness. He walked with nothing but his shame, and the faint echo of fire still smoldering in his chest, a reminder of the arrogance that had brought him here. The first villages he passed were wary of him. His robes marked him as a monk, but his eyes told another story. They were not calm, not serene. They were restless, haunted. Farmers bowed politely, but did not invite him in. Merchants gave him glances as sharp as their knives. To them he was a man without a place, a shadow of something he should have been. Yet as days turned into weeks, necessity forced him into their lives. He helped till fields, carried water, and lifted burdens that bent other men's backs. He asked for little in return, a meal, a place to sleep beneath a roof instead of the stars. Slowly the suspicion faded. He became not a monk, not a master, but simply a wanderer who gave his hands where they were needed. But service could not quiet the storm within him. At night, lying on straw mats or beneath open skies, he replayed the moment of his failure again and again. The strike, the fire, the look of his master as the force broke him. He clenched his fists until his knuckles cracked, whispering to himself that he would never again be so blind, never again so arrogant. Yet he also felt the pull of the dragon's flame still inside him, waiting, tempting. He knew he could not rid himself of it. All he could do was try to master it, even as it whispered promises he no longer trusted. As he traveled further, he saw more of Ionia than he had ever known within the walls of Shojin. He saw the rice terraces that gleamed like silver in the dawn. He saw the fishermen casting nets in rivers so wide the water seemed endless. He saw villages scarred by bandits, families broken by violence, children left to weep over burned homes. In those places, LEESIN fought not for glory but for survival, for others, not himself. He stood against raiders armed with crude blades, using only his fists and feet, striking with precision that left them sprawled in the dirt. Word began to spread of a blind monk who defended the weak, though few knew his name. The more he fought, the more he began to understand a truth that had always eluded him at Shojin. Strength was not a crown to be worn, nor a ladder to climb above others. It was a gift to be given. When he placed himself between a farmer and a thief, when he bore the brunt of a strike so a child could escape, when he used his power not to dominate but to shield, he felt something he had never felt before. Not pride, not arrogance, but purpose. Still, guilt remained a constant shadow. In quiet moments, when no one asked for his fists, he found himself kneeling in the dirt, trying once more to meditate as he had been taught. He breathed slowly, letting the sounds of the forest or the sea wash over him, trying to silence the storm within. Sometimes he managed moments of stillness. Sometimes he heard only the roaring echo of fire and the memory of his master's broken body. Yet even in failure, he continued. Perhaps, he told himself, redemption was not a single act but 1,000 small ones. Perhaps it was not found in glory, but in persistence. Seasons changed. His feet carried him from village to village, across rivers and through forests where the leaves fell in golden showers. His hands grew calloused not only from battle, but from labor, from the endless repetition of giving himself to others' needs. Some places remembered him with gratitude, some forgot him the moment he left. He asked for nothing, and in return he carried no burden but his own. Yet whispers of his presence began to travel further than he could. A blind monk who fought like a storm, who stood alone against many, who carried a fire in his movements, though his eyes saw nothing. The words reached the ears of travelers, of merchants, even of warriors who wondered who this man was and why he fought for people who were not his kin. LEESIN paid the whispers no mind. For him the road remained endless, and each day was only another chance to balance the weight of his sin with the weight of his service. There were nights when he dreamed of Shojin, of standing once more in the courtyard, of hearing the gong and the chants of his brothers. He dreamed of walking back through the gates, of being forgiven. But when he woke, the dream dissolved like mist, leaving only the cold truth. Forgiveness was not given, it had to be earned, and he was still at the beginning of that path. One evening, as he sat beside a fire in the mountains, a traveler asked him why he wandered. The man was old, his face lined, his clothes ragged from many journeys. LEESIN said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered, "Because I must." The traveler pressed no further. Perhaps he saw in LEESIN's blind eyes the weight of a story too heavy to tell, and so the exile walked on. The boy who had once spoken of dragons was gone, replaced by a man scarred by his own arrogance. A man seeking to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. But in the silence of his heart, where once there had been only pride, there was now something else. Not peace, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of humility. It was small, fragile, easily broken, but it was there, and it would grow. Chapter 5. A pilgrim of frozen lands. The road bent north, until the wind turned thin and tasted of iron, and the mountains rose like sleeping giants, whose backs were scarred by glaciers. LEESIN followed goat paths, where the air rang with ice, and every breath felt borrowed. He had left behind the humid songs of Ionia, the frogs in the paddies, the drums of village festivals, the hush of bamboo groves, and stepped into a world that spoke in avalanches and white silence. Snow fell in sifted veils that softened boulders and erased footprints, minutes after they were made. The cold punished carelessness and rewarded rhythm. Walk too fast and you burned out too slow, and the chills slipped into your bones like water, finding every crack and stone. He listened, as he had learned to do since exile, not with eyes but with everything else. The ragged breathing of his own lungs, the brittle creak of ice in a ravine, the distant rattle of antlers from beasts crossing a frozen river. In that desolation, humility was not a lesson but a condition of survival. He shared fires with hunters who spoke few words and chewed seal fat as if it were sacrament. He traded labor for shelter, splitting driftwood with patient blows, and learned to seal tents with snow to keep out needle winds. When raiders from the low passes tried to snatch sled dogs from a fisher's camp, he moved as the blizzard did, sudden, blinding, indifferent, and left them sprawled, weapons scattered like dead branches. Yet the cold stripped even victory of pride. Out here, triumph was not a banner raised high, but a breath taken, another step made, a life preserved for one more night. He had not come seeking battle. He came because he felt the road demand more of him than Ionia alone could give. He had done many small things to atone, but his debt felt glacial, ancient, immovable. Perhaps in a land where spirit and sky argued every hour, he might learn how to argue less with himself. On the 7th day of an icebound march, as dawn's weak light bled through cloud like milk through cloth, he felt another presence in the wind. Not seen, but unmistakable, a pulse in the air as if the land itself had drawn breath and held it. He stopped. Snow hissed across the crust at his feet. Far off, a caribou snorted, and then the world seemed to lean. The sensation arrived the way storms do, first as rumor, then as weight. It was not a single spirit, but a stampede of them, raw and tooth-bared, the kind that wore the shapes of beasts and broke men who thought mind alone could fence them. LEESIN readied himself, not with a stance, but with stillness, the kind that had been hardest to learn. The presence broke from the white like a boulder rolling out of fog, footfalls heavy, breath a furnace. The man was broad through the shoulders, wrapped in pelts scarred by claw and time. He smelled of pine smoke and wintered blood. His voice, when it came, was not a greeting but a test. You walk blind and unafraid in the Freljord. Why? LEESIN inclined his head. Because fear is loud. It drowns the sounds that keep you alive. The newcomer's chuckle sent vapor spiraling. You speak like you've been broken and glued back together. I was, LEESIN said simply, and the seams still show. The stranger circled once, the way a wolf might spirits stirred around him. A restless choir of bear, boar, hawk, pressing at the edges of LEESIN's senses. They were not gentled by prayer, nor chained by rites. They were companions of a man who could hold them without being devoured. Udir, the man said at last, giving his name not as title but weather, Spirit Walker. LEESIN, the monk answered, no titles. Wind combed the ridge and threw ice grit against their boots. You've come far to bleed in a land that does not know you, Udir said. What do you want here? LEESIN lifted his face to the cold, to hear what I cannot in warmer places. Udir grunted, then listened. What followed was not teaching in the Shojin sense, no scrolls or bells or neatly measured hours. Udir did not instruct so much as expose. He led LEESIN across fields of wind, where the earth sang through the soles of boots and ridges, drummed the spine with every gust. He showed him how a storm organizes itself, how its edge is knives and its heart a drumbeat, how the snow speaks different truths when it falls heavy or fine. At night, beside fires the color of old bronze, he said little, letting the pop of sap in the wood and the long breathing of sleeping dogs carry the rest. When they sparred, they did not trade forms. They traded weather. Udir crashed like bear and raked like tiger, then broke away with hawk suddenness, turning space into a weapon. LEESIN met him with breath-timed pivots, the listening footwork carved from years of blindness. Step where the wind thins, strike where heat blooms, yield where impact would waste strength, return it where bone accepts instruction. In those collisions, LEESIN felt something he had not allowed himself since exile. Joy. Not the pride-soaked triumphs of youth, but the clean joy of clarity, the body answering without hesitation, the spirit moving without dragging the past like a chain. Udir noticed, after one bout that ended with both men snow-dusted and laughing into their scarves, he said, your fire is not dead. You hid it so you wouldn't burn the world again. I burned more than the world, LEESIN replied. I burned the one who tried to keep me from it. Udir's answer was a long silence that did not feel empty. The spirits are not safe, he said finally. They are not meant to be. You don't put them in a box and label it wisdom. You wrestle them until you can share breath. And if they throw you, then you learn how to fall without breaking your teeth. Days became a ledger of small revelations. LEESIN learned that the line between summoning and surrender is hair-thin and always moving. That when he drew on the dragon within, he had once yanked it like a chain, and the chain had whipped back. In the Freljord, Power did not obey. It negotiated. A blizzard could be a teacher if you didn't shout over it. A starving wolf could be an ally if you respected the law that made it starve. He practiced breathing not to kindle heat for spectacle, but to keep the core warm without scolding. He practiced listening not to anticipate the opponent's pride, but to hear when his own tried to speak first. Sometimes he failed, and the old urges surged. The itch to hit harder than necessary, to prove a point no one was arguing. When that happened, Udyr pushed him into labor, haul meat, mend harness, dig trenches until his arms shook and his mind too tired to posture, lay down like a stubborn mule persuaded by dusk. They saved a child who had fallen through river ice without fanfare. Udyr broke the surface and anchored. LEESIN timed breath and grip with the river's pulse, hauling between heartbeats when currents slackened. No one cheered. The mother wept into her son's wet hair while the men warmed his ribs with their hands, careful as priests. Later, when fire held the tent, Udyr muttered, "Power is service." LEESIN repeated the words, not as lesson but as inventory. The feel of ice-eating fingers, the weight of a life carried toward warmth. News reached them in the form of a trader with frost-brittle eyebrows. Noxian steel had been seen on Ionian shores again. Banners like torn raven wings staked in fields where tea once grew. LEESIN sat very still while the trader spoke. The fire threw long blades of light across his bound eyes. Udyr watched him the way one watches a fault line. "You are thinking of your home," Udyr said. "Not as question. I'm thinking of sacred places," LEESIN answered, "of how easily they burn." The next morning, the cold had found a higher gear. Snow squeaked underfoot with the dry complaint of air too sharp for comfort. They broke camp without speaking, working in the rhythm of men who trusted each other's hands. At the ridge where the world fell away in blue-white ranges, Udyr faced him. "You came north to listen. What did you hear?" LEESIN took a long breath. The frost pinched his nostrils. The wind licked its scarred skin around his eyes. "That fire is not something I own," he said. "It visits. I can host it. I can be burned by it. I can refuse to feed it. But I cannot command it without becoming smaller than it is." Udyr's teeth flashed, not in mockery, but in weathered approval. "Good. Now go where that matters. Come with me," LEESIN said. "The request is natural as exhale." Udyr shrugged the vast shrug of mountains. "My path bends where spirits snarl, and people forget they are still people. But I will walk you to the place where the road decides you." They traveled south with winter at their backs. The land changed from knife to bowl, from white bell to green throat, but the lessons did not loosen. LEESIN carried them the way one carries tinder in a dry pouch. Protected, ready, never flaunted. On a cliff that smelled faintly of salt and slept above jade water. Udyr stopped. "From here," he said, "the fight is yours." They did not clasp forearms or vow brotherhood. They shared silence with the sea. Then the spirit walker turned into wind and pelt and was gone, his stride already talking to the land the way old friends do. LEESIN stood until the tide rearranged its breathing, then faced the direction where rumors said steel had stepped on sanctity. He did not quicken his pulse with promise or sharpen his jaw with rage. He counted breaths, found the one that matched the rhythm he had learned beneath the northern sky, and stepped forward. The dragon within did not surge. It settled, like a flame cupped against wind, ready for warmth or warning, but not spectacle. He was not absolved. The seams of the life he had broken were still visible, but his hands, once hungry for proof, were steadier. And the road ahead, toward Ionia, toward the places where bells once sang, no longer felt like a stage. It felt like work worth doing. Top of form, bottom of form, Chapter 6. War at the gates. The road that led LEESIN back to Ionia was heavy with memory. He could not walk its curves without hearing echoes of the boy he had once been, proud and untempered, climbing toward Shojin with fire already in his chest. Now the weight was different. His steps were steady, not urgent. His heart did not rush ahead of him, but measured each beat as though every breath were an oath to remain in balance. Yet even discipline cannot soften the sight of one's homeland in pain. Villages once peaceful stood scarred by blackened timbers. Fields where farmers had sung in rows of green now lay trampled under the boots of soldiers whose banners bore the blood red of Noxus. The invasion had not come quietly. It had struck like a tide, and though the Ionian people resisted fiercely, their serenity and tradition were no shield against disciplined legions trained to carve empires. LEESIN had returned with Udyr's teachings still fresh in his mind, the lessons of the Freljord, of power as service, of listening before striking. But those lessons were tested the moment he saw his homeland burning. He passed children weeping by roadsides, old men kneeling in ruined shrines, monks carrying water, not for rituals but to douse flames. At every turn he felt the dragon stir inside him, restless, angry, eager to roar against the desecration. Yet he remembered the river ice breaking under the child in the north, remembered the weight of restraint as much as the strength of action. Rage would not heal Ionia, but even restraint had its limits. The Hirana Monastery, perched high in the mountains beyond the valleys of bamboo and winding rivers, had always been a place of reverence. Its bells could be heard for miles on days of calm, calling the faithful to prayer. Its carved roofs shimmered with the red of lacquer and gold. Its archives held parables and teachings as old as the first Ionian kings. To LEESIN, Hirana was not just sacred ground. It was a mirror of what Shojin had been, a reminder of what he had lost and what he must protect. When word reached him that Noxian troops marched upon it, something within him crystallized. He could not let another sanctuary fall. The road to Hirana wound steeply through gorges where mists coiled like living things. The air grew sharper, thinner, carrying with it the cries of distant battle. When LEESIN crested the final ridge, he saw the monastery besieged. Noxian soldiers in blackened armor swarmed the steps, their shields braced, their formation pressing upward like iron grinding against stone. The monks of Hirana stood at the gates, unarmed but unyielding, their chants weaving into the wind. Even as arrows fell among them, incense smoke mixed with the acrid tang of blood and oil, the sacred was being devoured. LEESIN descended into the fray. His bare feet struck stone like thunder, his fists breaking shields, his kicks scattering armored men. He moved with the clarity of one who fought not for himself, but for something beyond. Yet for every soldier he felled, another climbed the steps. The Noxian war machine was relentless, its discipline unshaken by loss. He felt the pressure mounting, the monastery trembling behind him, and the dragon within him whispered again. It was not the whisper of arrogance this time, but of urgency. Call me, or all will be ash. For a long moment he resisted. He remembered the courtyard of Shojin, the broken body of his master, the guilt that had driven him into exile. But then he looked upon Hirana's gates, where statues of serene warrior saints stood defiled, and upon the monks who knelt in prayer, though death pressed at their door. He understood. This was not about pride, nor about proving destiny. This was about service, about giving what only he could give, no matter the cost. He inhaled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He struck his stance. The dragon answered. Fire erupted from his body, a vortex of energy that roared through the air like a storm-given flesh. His heel lashed out, and the force of it split the ground, shattering ranks of soldiers as though they were leaves caught in a gale. The heat seared banners to ash, sent armor glowing red, turned cries of defiance into screams of terror. The power he had once sought recklessly now consumed him utterly, more than his body could contain. Yet he did not stop. Each strike was a sun bursting. Each motion was fire itself taking form. The Noxians fell back, burned and broken, their formation in ruins. The Hirana was saved. But when the last soldier fled, and silence fell upon the smoking steps, LEESIN collapsed. The fire that had surged through him did not leave gently. It ripped away something fundamental, a price no less harsh than exile. When he tried to open his eyes, there was only darkness. The dragon had granted him victory, but it had taken his sight. He lay there for what felt like ages, the sounds of monks rushing to his side, muffled by the ringing void in his ears. Their voices trembled between gratitude and sorrow. He had saved them, yes, but at what cost? His eyes, once sharp with ambition, were empty now, their light gone forever. He felt the weight of it, not only in his body, but in his spirit. Sight had always been his weapon, his way of proving himself superior, his measure of mastery. Now it was gone, and with it the boy who had demanded to be chosen was gone too. The elders of Hirana did not cast him out. Instead, they carried him into their halls, tended his burns, and gave him a place among them. They understood what he had sacrificed, and perhaps they saw in his loss the seed of the humility he had always lacked. Yet LEESIN himself could not accept peace so easily. He lay awake in the darkness, feeling the dragon still within him, not silent but restless. He wondered if he had finally learned balance, or if he had simply traded one blindness for another. But when the monks came to him, bowing, thanking him for saving their home, he bowed his head in return. For the first time in his life, the gesture was not empty. He had not fought for pride, nor for destiny, nor for glory. He had fought because the sacred must be protected, because strength unused in defense of others is strength wasted. And though the price had been his sight, he felt for the first time that perhaps his fire could finally serve more than his own ambition. Still, he knew this was not the end of his journey. Darkness was now his companion, but within it, he would learn to see in ways he had never imagined. The war was not over. Ionia still bled, and somewhere within the blackness, the dragon still burned, not as a master to command, but as a force to be honored. LEESIN would walk forward, step by step, guided not by eyes but by purpose. Chapter 7. The dragon's fire darkness came to LEESIN not like the setting of the sun, but like the collapse of the world itself. When the dragon's fire left him on the steps of Hirana Monastery, the smoke cleared, the battlefield fell silent, and he opened his eyes to nothingness. Shapes, colors, light, all gone. In their place was a void that pulsed with each throb of pain in his skull. The monks lifted him gently from the stone, their hands trembling as they laid him on a reed mat inside the temple, but their gratitude could not soften the weight of his loss. He had saved them, yes, yet in doing so, he had sacrificed the very thing he once prized above all his sight. For days he did not move. He listened to the hush of robes against the floor, to the chanting that filled the halls at dawn, to the wind curling through the temple's carved windows. Sounds he had once ignored now became his world. Each reminded him of what he had lost. The sight of the bells swaying, the glow of the morning sun, the faces of his brothers. He clenched his fists in frustration, the same hands that had unleashed the fire now useless to bring back the light. He thought often of Shojin and of the master he had crippled, how arrogance had destroyed his life once before. Was this too arrogance's punishment? Was blindness the price demanded by the dragon for daring to summon its fury again? Yet though he raged, the world did not end. Hunger forced him to rise. Necessity pushed him to walk. At first he stumbled into walls, knocked over bowls, bruised his shins against stone steps. The monks guided him patiently, offering arms when he faltered, but LEESIN resisted their help. Pride had once been his poison. Now he feared relying on others would keep him weak. He forced himself to learn again, each step measured, each hand tracing the texture of walls, each sound mapped in his mind. Slowly, clumsily, the darkness became less absolute. He began to hear patterns he had never noticed. The pace of footsteps, the pitch of voices, the way wind whistled differently through narrow passages than open courtyards. Where once his eyes had ruled, now every part of him listened. Training began again, not by his choice, but by the insistence of Hirana's masters. "You are not broken," one told him. "You are changed. Learn to see differently." They placed him before wooden dummies, told him to strike, not with sight, but with hearing. At first he missed, his fists glancing off empty air. Laughter from younger monks stung worse than bruises. But LEESIN did not yield. He had yielded before, when exile had broken him, and it had taken years to crawl back to purpose. He would not make the same mistake now. He stood in the courtyard, day after day, listening to the wind until he could predict its rhythm, striking when the gust bent around the wooden posts, his fists connecting cleanly at last. The tasks grew harder. Monks sparred with him silently, circling with padded sticks, waiting to strike. He failed often, his body marked by red welts, yet each failure sharpened him. He learned to feel the shift of air before a blow landed, to hear the tightening of muscles in the intake of breath. Where others relied on vision, he relied on presence. What began as stumbling adaptation became something more, a clarity he had never possessed when his eyes were whole. In meditation, too, the darkness forced him deeper. Before he had squirmed impatient, dismissing stillness as wasted time. Now stillness was his only refuge. He listened inward, to the flame that coiled within him. The dragon was still there, restless, dangerous, the same power that had crippled his master and stolen his sight. But he no longer demanded it obey. He treated it as a guest, one whose presence must be respected. At times its heat surged, tempting him to unleash it. But he breathed through the temptation until it quieted. Power, he began to see, was not possession. It was a trust, one that could be honored or betrayed. The monks of Ionia, once wary of him, came to see him differently. Where he had been a youth of arrogance, now he became a man of patience. He sparred against 3, then 5, moving through their strikes with a grace they could not match. He poured tea without spilling a drop, balanced on thin beams by listening to the wind shift under his weight. Blindness was no longer weakness, but advantage. Opponents underestimated him, and when they struck, he moved like water, flowing where they pressed, striking where they opened. His kicks carried not only force, but precision. His fists landed with the certainty of one who listened to every detail of the world around him. But the world beyond Ionia did not remain still. Messengers came with news of villages ravaged, shrines stripped of relics, Noxian boots still crushing Ionian soil. LEESIN sat quietly, his hands folded, the words sinking into him like stones into a well. He had once sought greatness to prove himself. He had once fought for pride, but now he understood his fire must serve something greater. The sacred was burning, and he could not remain within safe walls while his people suffered. When he announced his intention to leave, the elders did not forbid him. They bowed, acknowledging that his path was no longer just for himself, but for Ionia. Before he departed, he bound a strip of red cloth across his ruined eyes. It was not to hide his blindness, but to declare it, a vow that he would never again take sight or power for granted. As he stepped once more onto the road, the fire in his chest did not roar as it once had. It smoldered steadily, cupped against the wind, ready to defend rather than consume. He was no longer the boy who boasted of destiny, nor the exile who wandered in shame. He was LEESIN, the blind monk, tempered by fire and silence. His sight was gone, but his vision had never been clearer. Chapter 8. The Blind Pilgrimage. When LEESIN left the steppes of Ionia, he carried no pack, no weapon, no token of wealth. The red cloth bound across his ruined eyes was his only mark, a vow woven in silence. Each step down the mountain was deliberate, each breath measured, as though the very air tested his resolve. The dragon's fire still smoldered inside him, but it no longer burned recklessly. It whispered, a presence to be honored, a reminder of the price already paid. He was blind, yes, but not broken. The road stretched endlessly, winding through valleys where bamboo groves whispered in the wind, across bridges where rivers sang against their banks, and into villages where eyes widened at the sight of a monk walking without sight, guided only by his staff. At first people doubted him. Some thought him mad, a beggar wrapped in red cloth. But doubt turned to awe when danger approached. Once, a band of raiders cornered a farmer's family outside their home, weapons raised, laughter cruel. LEESIN stepped between them, calm as stone. He listened, felt the air shift as blades were drawn back, and moved. His fists struck like thunder. His kicks landed with precision no sight could have given. In moments, the raiders lay groaning in the dirt. The family knelt, thanking him, but he only shook his head and said, "Protect one another. My strength is borrowed, yours must be lasting." Then he walked on. Word began to spread of a blind monk whose movements were swifter than eyes could follow, who defended the weak with hands of fire and steel. He did not seek the rumors, nor did he deny them. Each day was another lesson in humility, another chance to balance the scales of his past. He worked in fields, carried wood, taught children stances to defend themselves. These acts, small though they seemed, wove themselves into the fabric of his pilgrimage. Redemption, he began to see, was not won in a single battle. It was carved step by step, like water shaping stone. Yet the pilgrimage was not without trial. Blindness was still a weight, one that mocked him when he stumbled over roots or misjudged the distance of a step. At night, he dreamed of light, of the monastery courtyards, of cherry blossoms, drifting against a blue sky he would never see again. He woke each time with sorrow pressing against his chest. But sorrow did not stop him. It tempered him. If blindness had taken the world of sight from him, then he would learn to perceive a world beyond vision. Meditation deepened as he walked. Sitting beneath trees or in ruined shrines, he listened to the rhythm of the earth itself. He heard the heartbeat of sparrows in the rafters, the slow exhale of rivers through stone, the tremor of distant footsteps carried on soil. In those moments, he began to realize that his blindness was not the end of perception, but the beginning of something greater. Sight had always distracted him with its illusions of color and shape. Now, stripped of that, he could listen to the essence beneath appearances. But shadows followed him. Noxian soldiers still marched across Ionia, their presence a constant wound. Twice he crossed patrols who mocked his blindness, only to fall when they discovered how little it hindered him. Once, in a burning village, he fought until his body screamed, saving those he could, but knowing he could not save all. Each time the dragon stirred, demanding release, he reminded himself of the broken master at Shojin, of the flames that had stolen his sight. He would use the fire only when no other path remained. The vow was harder than any battle, but it was one he clung to with every fiber of discipline. Seasons changed. Rain swelled rivers, summer heat baked the roads, autumn leaves crackled beneath his feet. Still he walked. Each village he left behind carried whispers of the blind monk. Some called him guardian, others a spirit in human form, others still a cursed man who burned with hidden fire. LEESIN ignored the names. What mattered was the work. A child no longer hungry, a shrine no longer desecrated, a life preserved one more day. And in time, his pilgrimage brought him not only peace but clarity. He understood now that his exile had once been a running away, an attempt to escape guilt without facing it. This pilgrimage was different. He was no longer fleeing. He was walking into the heart of his failure, into the truth of who he had become. Blindness was not punishment. It was a teacher. It demanded patience, humility, and above all, service. When at last he heard the bells of Shojin carried faintly on the wind, his steps faltered. The monastery he had once left in shame called to him again. He could not see its carved roofs or stone courtyards, but he felt them in memory, the place where his pride had first broken another's body. He knew he would return, not as a prodigal son demanding recognition, but as a penitent seeking balance. The blind pilgrimage was far from over. Yet with each step toward Shojin, he carried the lessons of Harana, the fire of the dragon, and the clarity of darkness. He was ready not to claim destiny, but to serve it. Chapter 9. The return to Shojin. The path back to Shojin wound like an old scar across the mountains, etched deep by centuries of pilgrims and seekers. LEESIN walked it slowly, his staff tapping stone with each step, his breath steady against the thin air. The last time he had climbed these steps, he was a boy, brimming with arrogance, convinced that destiny had singled him out. He had entered Shojin, boasting of the dragon's choice, left it in shame after crippling his master, and wandered the world blind with guilt. Now he returned, not as the boy who sought glory, but as a man tempered by fire and silence. The wind carried familiar scents, incense drifting from shrines along the path, pine resin from the forests that clung to the cliffs, the faint sweetness of cherry blossoms scattered by the season's last bloom. Memories pressed in with every sound and smell. He remembered his first days within Shojin's walls, striking dummies until his hands bled, bristling under lessons of humility he had refused to hear. He remembered sneaking into the archives by candlelight, hungering for forbidden power. He remembered the day pride shattered his life. The mountain seemed to whisper his past back to him, but he did not stumble. He listened, acknowledged, and moved on. When the monastery gates finally came into reach, the sound of their carved wood resonated through his bones. He raised a hand and touched the grain, tracing the same grooves he had run his fingers over as a boy. For a moment he stood still, uncertain whether the monks inside would welcome him or turn him away. He had not earned their forgiveness, but forgiveness was not why he had come. He had come because the cycle of his life demanded it, because only by facing Shojin again could he complete the circle he had broken. The gates opened with the creak of wood and the murmur of monks. Silence fell when they saw him, taller now, his eyes bound in red cloth, the weight of years written in the set of his shoulders. Whispers rippled through the courtyard, not of awe, but of recognition. The boy who had once been cast out had returned, blind yet unbroken. An elder stepped forward, his voice lined with age. "LEESIN," he said softly, "you have come back." LEESIN bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching the stone. "I come not to reclaim what I lost," he said. "I come to serve if you will let me." The monks led him inside, and he felt the monastery embrace him once more. The air was the same, scented with sandalwood and smoke. The stone beneath his feet still held the warmth of the sun. Yet he knew he would never see the halls again as he once had. He did not need to. His perception now was deeper, richer, woven from sound, scent, vibration, and memory. The walls spoke to him through their silence, the monks through their breathing, the mountain itself through the wind curling through its arches. For days he remained still, kneeling in meditation, letting the weight of the place settle around him. He was not tested immediately. The elders watched, measured, and waited. They saw no arrogance in him now, only patience. When the time came, they invited him to the courtyard, where young initiates sparred under the sun. They asked him to join. LEESIN obeyed. The initiates circled him, skeptical, for to them he was only a blind man. But when they struck, he moved with effortless clarity, his feet shifting on stone, his fists flowing like water, his body guided not by eyes, but by every sound and shift of air. The initiates fell one by one, humbled not by his strength, but by his serenity. The elders nodded. "You are not who you once were," one said. "The boy who burned with arrogance is gone. What remains is tempered." Still, LEESIN did not claim victory. He bowed to the initiates he had defeated and said, "What I know now was bought with failure. Learn from me, not of pride, but of patience." In the weeks that followed, he began to teach. He guided novices not only in stances and strikes, but in listening to breath, to silence, to themselves. Some resisted, finding his methods strange. Others embraced them, realizing that the absence of sight revealed a deeper kind of vision. The monastery began to change with him, its traditions enriched by his hard-earned wisdom. At night, alone in his chamber, he still felt the dragon's fire coiled within him. but it no longer threatened to consume. It rested, quiet, a reminder and a companion. He no longer feared it. He no longer demanded from it. He honored it as part of himself, as inseparable as his scars, his blindness, his breath. The boy who had once fled Shojin in disgrace had returned as a man. He had not come to erase the past. He had come to carry it, to transform it, to let it teach others. In that he found peace. Not final, not complete, but true enough to guide his next steps. Chapter 10. The Discipline of the Blind Monk. The days within Shojin flowed like water through stone, familiar yet transformed. LEESIN woke before dawn to the sound of the gong that had once stirred his boyhood pride. Then he had leapt from his mat hungry for glory. Now he rose slowly, each motion deliberate, savoring the cool air that drifted through the paper screens. He listened to the monastery's heart, sandals brushing over stone, the low murmur of prayer, incense crackling as it caught flame. The world was not dark to him anymore. It was layered, textured, filled with details most eyes never bothered to notice. He began each morning in meditation. In the courtyard, beneath the ringing bells, he sat with his legs crossed and his palms resting lightly upon his knees. He breathed with the rhythm of the mountain, deep and steady, until his body seemed to dissolve into the silence. The dragon's fire within him smoldered still, restless, but he no longer feared it. He did not summon it, nor suppress it. He sat with it as one might sit with an old adversary turned uneasy companion. He acknowledged its presence, let it flare and fade, allowed it to remind him that power must be honored rather than commanded. When the sun rose higher, the courtyard filled with initiates. They sparred with padded staves and shouted their exertions with every blow. LEESIN joined them, not as rival, but as example. His strikes landed against wooden posts with the precision of a drumbeat, timed to the cadence of his breath. He listened to the resonance of each strike, adjusting his form until the vibrations echoed back into his bones. Where others strained for power, he sought only harmony between breath, motion, and intent. The young monks watched him with awe. To them, his blindness was paradox, weakness made into strength. They saw him move as though he knew where every strike would land before it was thrown. They whispered of the aura around him, the subtle warmth that seemed to hum in the air when he fought. But LEESIN dismissed their admiration with quiet words. "Do not follow me because I can strike," he told them. "Follow me because I can stop." Power without restraint is not discipline. It is danger. The elders of Shojin tested him constantly, though never in ways that resembled his youthful trials. They asked him to carry water across narrow beams, listening for the sway beneath his feet. They asked him to serve tea to visiting dignitaries, his hands steady though eyes useless. They sent him to cross markets crowded with traders, guiding himself only by the rhythms of their movements, never colliding, never breaking stride. Each test was meant to weigh his patience, his humility, his control. Failure no longer stung him. It taught him. Success no longer swelled him. It reminded him to remain vigilant. Still, peace within Shojin was not enough to quiet the world beyond its gates. Messengers arrived bearing grim tidings. Noxian soldiers still stalked in Olnin lands, burning shrines, defiling temples, pressing villages into ruin. Though the great invasions had ended, the scars remained raw, and smaller bands of occupiers still festered in the wounds of the land. Each report stirred the dragon within LEESIN. It whispered of fire, of vengeance, of justice delivered in flame. He remembered the courtyard of Shojin in his youth, remembered his master's broken body, remembered blindness descending with searing agony. He breathed. He did not rise in anger, but he knew he would not remain behind Shojin's walls forever. When he left the monastery on short journeys, he tested his balance against the world. He walked through forests, listening to the wind chase itself through bamboo leaves. He sat beside rivers, aligning his breath with the pulse of water over stone. Sometimes he accepted challenges from warriors who had heard tales of the blind monk, they approached him boasting, eager to prove themselves against a man without sight. He never humiliated them. He flowed around their strikes, disarmed them gently, pressed them to the ground without cruelty. Discipline, he said, each time is not in the strike. It is in knowing when not to strike. At night, when silence covered the monastery, he still felt the dragon coiled inside him. Its heat was no longer pain, but a steady reminder of who he was. He practiced channeling just enough to warm his body in the mountain cold, then letting the fire dissipate with his exhale. He no longer feared losing control, but he never forgot that the fire was dangerous. Power, he had learned, was not a trophy to display, but a blade that must always be sheathed until the moment of need. Shojin itself began to change with him, where once its lessons had been rigid, focused on perfection of form and the mastery of body, now its novices also learned patience, listening, restraint. LEESIN's presence infused the monastery with humility. The elders did not resist this change. They saw that in him exile had carved wisdom, blindness had deepened sight, fire had shaped discipline. The name the monks began to whisper for him carried no malice now, the blind monk. And LEESIN accepted it, not as a title of shame, but as a truth. Yet even in peace, he felt the horizon tugging at him. He could not remain forever within stone walls while Ionia still suffered. He understood that Shojin was not merely a place. It was the discipline carried wherever he walked. One day he would hear the bells call him outward again, and he would walk the roads not as a boy seeking destiny, nor as an exile hiding from guilt, but as a man who had learned the balance between fire and stillness. For now he trained, he listened, and he waited. His strikes were sharp, his breath calm, his presence steady. He carried his blindness like a banner not of loss, but of clarity. The dragon within him burned quietly, patient as his own heart, and when the world called, he would be ready, not to fight for glory, but to guard what was sacred, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to serve the balance that Ionia had always demanded. Chapter 11. The Guardian of Sacred Places. The bells of Shojin rang with the same clarity they had when LEESIN was a boy, yet now their resonance stirred something different in him. Back then he had heard them as a call to prove himself, to show his strength, to grasp at destiny. Now he heard them as reminders of duty, not to himself but to all that Ionia held sacred. The sound spread across valleys and rivers, across fields where farmers bent to the soil, across shrines where incense curled in steady devotion. Every tone spoke of the responsibility that fell on those who had the strength to protect what could not protect itself. It was not long before LEESIN felt the road calling again. He bowed to the elders of Shojin, promising not to abandon the monastery but to extend its spirit beyond the gates. A monastery is not walls, he told them. It is the discipline we carry wherever we stand. With that, he took his staff and stepped into Ionia once more, not as an exile wandering aimlessly, but as a monk who had found clarity in blindness. His path was no longer to seek redemption, only for himself, but to guard the sanctity of his homeland. His journey led him through villages where the wounds of invasion still lingered. He passed shrines stripped of relics, their altars bare and cracked from fire. He found temples where sacred gardens had been trampled by boots, their blossoms crushed beneath the weight of iron. Farmers and travelers whispered of Noxian warbands who still roamed, taking what they wished and mocking the faith of those too weak to resist. For many, the war was over. For Ionia, it was still being fought in every grove and shrine. LEESIN became a shadow moving between those places, his presence sudden and decisive. Once, in a riverside temple where carved statues of guardian spirits had been toppled, he found mercenaries drinking wine from stolen offering bowls. They laughed when they saw him, a blind monk with only a staff. Yet before the first cup hit the ground, LEESIN had moved. His feet slid across stone with the grace of water. His staff cracked against jaw and chest. His heel drove one man sprawling. His elbow dropped another into silence. The fight ended before their mockery did. He set the bowls back upon the altar, placed blossoms in the water, and whispered the prayers the monks had taught him. Strength defended, but reverence restored. In another village, he found farmers gathered in fear. Raiders had demanded tribute of rice and silk, threatening to torch the fields if they were not obeyed. LEESIN did not boast, nor did he rally them with speeches. He waited by the road, still as a tree. When the raiders arrived, he stepped forward. Their laughter rang, mocking the cloth over his eyes, the staff in his hand. But then he struck, swift, precise, with the patience of a man who had trained for years not to waste a single motion. One by one they fell, weapons scattering into the dirt. The farmers wept with relief, but LEESIN only bowed. "Your fields are sacred," he told them. "Protect them as you protect one another. Let this not be the last time you stand." The blind monk became a guardian spoken of in whispers across Ionia. Travelers told stories of him appearing where temples were threatened, where graves were defiled, where families prayed for deliverance. Some called him a spirit sent by the dragon itself. Others said he was a cursed man paying for unseen sins. LEESIN ignored both. What mattered to him was the work, the protection of the sacred, the defense of those who could not defend themselves. Yet the task was never simple. Sacred places were not only shrines and monasteries, they were also the hearts of people. In one mountain village, he found children orphaned by war, surviving only on scraps. He sat among them, teaching them to breathe with discipline, to move with balance, not to fight for vengeance, but to steady their hearts against despair. In their laughter, hesitant at first, and then unrestrained, he felt the dragon's warmth as clearly as any battle's fire. Protecting sacredness was not always striking down the defiler. Sometimes it was nurturing what remained. Still, there were nights when he doubted himself. He would sit alone in abandoned temples, the silence pressing against him like the weight of stone. He remembered the arrogance of his youth, the fire that had blinded him, the master he had crippled. He asked himself whether his guardianship was service or still, in some hidden corner of his soul, a grasp for redemption. But each time doubt threatened, he breathed. He remembered Udir's words in the Freljord, "Power is service." If he acted not for himself, but for the balance of Ionia, then doubt could not rule him. His blindness, once curse, became his greatest ally. Where others saw only the surface, he perceived essence. He heard hesitation in the breath of liars, felt the tremor of fear in the ground beneath unsteady feet, sensed the arrogance that always preceded a blade raised against the sacred. In battle, his enemies could not read his eyes, for there was nothing in them to betray him. His strikes landed with uncanny timing. His dodges seemed born of foresight. To those who fought him, it was as though the land itself guided his movements. But LEESIN never sought to be feared. Fear was loud, and loudness drowned wisdom. He sought to be a reminder that Ionia's spirit was not broken, that sacredness was not so easily erased. Each shrine he defended, each temple he restored, was not only protection but a message. The Noxians might burn fields and topple statues, but they could not break the will of a people who still carried reverence in their hearts. In time, even the monks of other orders came to recognize his guardianship. Some invited him to teach, asking him to show their novices how to listen as he did. LEESIN accepted when the call aligned with his path, sharing not techniques of spectacle, but lessons of patience, of humility, of discipline. Strength is not to be feared, he told them. Strength that does not serve is weakness, disguised. As seasons turned, the blind monk's legend grew. Yet to him there was no legend. There was only the next road, the next shrine, the next life in need. He walked Ionia not to carve his name into history, but to erase the arrogance that had once burned him. He walked because the sacred must be protected, and because he had learned that discipline is not something taught once, but chosen again and again. In every step, in every breath, in every strike. And so he became more than a monk, more than an exile, More than a warrior, he became a guardian, not of relics or temples alone, but of Ionia's spirit itself. The bells of Shojin still rang behind him, but their echoes carried wherever he went, for Shojin lived now in his every motion. And in the silence after the bells, when he closed his eyes against the cloth and breathed, LEESIN felt no pride, no regret, only the steady rhythm of purpose. Chapter 12. The Trial of Fire and Stillness. The road carried LEESIN deeper into the heart of Ionia, where mountains curved like the backs of slumbering dragons, and rivers threaded the land with silver veins. Though seasons had shifted, the scars of war lingered still. Fields lay fallow where they had once flourished. Shrines bore the blackened marks of fire. Children played in courtyards where laughter had returned, but their eyes carried a shadow too old for their years. LEESIN moved among them with the patience of stone, offering not speeches of hope but presence. Sometimes presence was enough. He guarded where needed, taught where, asked and rebuilt, where destruction had left only silence. Yet with every act of service, he felt the fire inside him whisper louder. The dragon was never gone. It coiled always at the center of his being, reminding him of its hunger. In meditation, he felt its heat press against his ribs, testing him, daring him to summon its strength. He feared it less than before, but fearlessness was not mastery. He knew the fire still waited for a moment of weakness to consume him. One evening, while resting in a ruined monastery whose roof had caved beneath old bombardment, LEESIN felt the dragon's presence flare stronger than ever. He sat alone among the broken columns, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp stone. His staff lay across his knees. At first, silence wrapped him as it always did, steady and grounding. But then the silence shifted. It grew heavy, pressing into his chest. He felt heat swell in his lungs, rising as if the dragon itself clawed to be released. He tightened his breath, focusing on restraint. But restraint faltered. Flames coiled from his skin in flickering streams, not vast enough to engulf, but enough to illuminate the shattered temple in an orange glow. His blindfold grew hot against his scarred eyes. He clenched his fists, hearing again the echo of Shojin's courtyard. His master's scream, the searing crack of fire destroying more than flesh. The memory rushed back, unbearable. His heart pounded, his chest convulsed. For a breath, he nearly surrendered. Then a voice cut through the fire. "You are not the flame." It was not spoken aloud, but resounded within him, low and resonant, like the mountain itself had chosen to speak. He froze. The fire writhed, testing him. He repeated the words silently. "I am not the flame. I am the vessel." The heat subsided slightly. He exhaled. The dragon pressed harder, demanding recognition. He bowed his head and whispered, "I honor you, but you do not rule me." The flames withdrew into his body, leaving only smoke curling upward through the collapsed beams. LEESIN trembled, sweat soaking through his robes, but he was still whole. He understood then that his journey was not only to serve Ionia outwardly, but also to guard against the wars within himself. The fire was not enemy nor ally. It was truth. It would never vanish. His discipline would always be tested. The following days brought confirmation. Word spread of a Noxian commander leading a band of veterans who pillaged sacred groves and left fields salted in their wake. Villagers begged for deliverance, whispering that no one could stand against him. LEESIN followed their pleas to a valley where cherry trees grew in scarlet arcs above a shrine carved into the rock. Smoke trailed into the sky. Soldiers stood at the gates, blades dripping, laughter harsh. LEESIN walked into their midst with the calm of still water. He heard their mocking voices, the clank of steel, the confidence of men who had never known defeat. The commander stepped forward, his armor heavy with emblems of conquest, a blind beggar. He sneered, "Do you come to pray for these peasants before we cut you down?" LEESIN inclined his head. "I come to offer you mercy. Leave now. Take nothing more. Defile nothing further." Their laughter answered. The soldiers surged. LEESIN moved as though the earth itself guided him. His staff whirled, deflecting blades, cracking against breastplates. His kicks shattered balance. His fists fell with precision. He struck not with rage, but with necessity, flowing where they pressed, yielding where they expected resistance, answering with calm ferocity. One by one they collapsed, groaning in the dirt. The commander alone remained, his breath thick with fury. "You hide behind restraint," the man spat. "But you are fire. I see it in you." LEESIN steadied his stance. He felt the dragon stir, its heat rushing through his veins, eager to prove the commander's words. The temptation nearly broke him. To unleash the fire would end the battle in a breath. But then he remembered the ruined temple, the whisper that had saved him. "You are not the flame." He exhaled, letting the fire settle into warmth instead of blaze. He advanced slowly, each step measured. The commander roared and swung his massive blade. LEESIN listened to the rush of steel, the grunt of exertion, the whistle of air, and sidestepped at the last instant. His staff snapped upward, striking the man's wrist. The blade clattered to the ground. LEESIN pressed his palm against the commander's chest, a gesture of both control and mercy. "Go," he said. "Take your men and leave. Carry this memory with you." Ionia does not yield. Shaken, the commander stumbled back. His soldiers, already broken, dragged him away. The villagers emerged, kneeling before LEESIN in gratitude. He raised his hand. "Do not kneel. Rise. Protect this place yourselves. I am only a guardian for a time. You must become guardians always." That night, as the villagers restored their shrine with blossoms and prayer, LEESIN sat apart beneath the cherry trees. He listened to their laughter, their relief. The crackle of incense lit anew. The fire within him rested, quiet. He had resisted it, not by denial, but by choosing stillness over fury. For the first time, he understood that discipline was not a single victory, but a lifelong trial. Each day would bring temptation. Each battle would whisper for fire, and each breath would demand the balance he had sworn to keep. In the silence, he whispered to himself, "I am not the flame. I am the vessel, and the dragon," for once did not argue. Chapter 13. The Weight of a Legend. The story spread faster than LEESIN's own footsteps. In mountain villages, farmers whispered of a blind monk who had faced a company of Noxians, who driven them away with nothing but a staff. In river towns, boatmen swore they had seen him walk alone into enemy camps and return untouched, leaving only silence behind. Children spoke his name as though he were not man but spirit, a guardian wandering wherever sacred places wept. LEESIN heard these stories as echoes on the road. He listened in tea houses where merchants spoke over steaming cups, in temples where priests repeated them as sermons, in market squares where strangers argued over details. The tales grew each time, flames erupting from his body, armies fleeing at the sound of his step, enemies blinded by the cloth across his eyes. He did not correct them. Legends had their own lives, but he did not let them claim him either, for he knew the truth. He was no spirit, no invincible warrior. He was a man burdened by discipline, carrying the scars of failure and the fire of a dragon that never truly slept. Yet legend was a weight. Wherever he went, people expected salvation. Villagers pressed offerings into his hands, rice, fruit, prayer beads, as though gifts might bind him to them forever. Mothers begged him to stay, to guard their children, to live among them as protector. Some looked at him with worship, others with fear, wondering what it meant for a man to wield such unseen fire. LEESIN accepted their gratitude with humility, but he reminded them always, "I am here only for a time. You must guard yourselves. Sacredness is not kept by one man, but by all who honor it." Still, he felt the pull of expectation grow heavier. There were nights when he sat alone beneath trees, listening to the rustle of leaves, and wondered if he had exchanged one prison for another. Once he had been bound by arrogance, chasing glory. Now he risked being bound by reputation, trapped in the role of savior. and he knew saviors often burned as quickly as the fires they carried. It was during these reflections that he returned to Shojin for counsel. The elders welcomed him with quiet bows, their faces etched deeper with years, but their eyes sharp. They asked of his travels, of the places he had protected, of the people who now spoke his name as though it carried weight greater than steel. He told them the truth, that he had done what he could, that he had turned aside blades and restored shrines, but that the burden of expectation grew heavier with each step. People will always seek to place their hopes in one man, said the eldest among them. It is easier than carrying the burden themselves, but you must not mistake their hope for your duty. You are not their savior. You are their reminder. LEESIN bowed, and if I fail to remind them, then you remind yourself, the elder answered. Discipline begins not with others, but within. He carried those words back onto the road. They steadied him when villages begged for more than he could give, when crowds pressed too close, when his own heart trembled at the thought of failing them. He was not savior, he was reminder, and reminders need not be flawless. They need only be true. Even so, the dragon tested him. In one valley he faced a militia of deserters who had carved out their own kingdom of cruelty. They had taken over a shrine to the First Land, defacing its walls with crude symbols and chaining villagers as laborers. When LEESIN entered their camp, they laughed, boasting of the fire they had heard about, daring him to unleash it. And for a moment, temptation surged. If he released the dragon's flame, the battle would end in heartbeats. He felt its heat rise in his chest, begging for command. But he breathed. He remembered the elder's words, remembered the ruined temple, where he had nearly surrendered, remembered the mantra whispered into stillness. I am not the flame, I am the vessel. The battle that followed was not quick. It was long, grueling, filled with bruises and sweat. LEESIN fought without spectacle, striking with staff and fist flowing with patience. He endured pain rather than risk the fire. One by one, the deserters fell, not to dragon's fury, but to human discipline. When at last the shrine was free, the villagers looked at him with awe, whispering of restraint greater than any blaze. He smiled faintly, bowing low. The legend had grown again, but this time it carried truth. As the months turned to seasons, LEESIN accepted his role not as savior but as symbol. The blind monk became a figure not of destruction but of discipline, not of fear but of balance. He was proof that failure could be transformed, that blindness could become vision, that fire could serve without consuming. In his presence, people remembered their own strength, their own duty to sacredness, and that was enough. Yet he never allowed himself comfort. Each night he returned to meditation, feeling the dragon coil within him, its heat ready to rise. He whispered to it, as always, "You are not my master. You are my companion. We walk together, but I lead the steps." And each night the fire settled, quiet, waiting for the next trial. LEESIN knew his legend would outgrow him. Stories would make him more than he was, perhaps even less. But he also knew that legend was not his to control. What he could control was his next breath, his next step, his next act of service. That was discipline, and that was enough. And so the blind monk walked on, carrying the weight of a legend but not crushed by it. He walked not for glory, not for redemption, not even for the people's praise. He walked because the sacred must be protected, because fire must be balanced with stillness, because discipline is not a moment but a lifetime. And with each step, the bells of Shojin echoed faintly in his heart, guiding him forward, steady as breath, endless as the road itself. Chapter 14. The Balance. Tested. The Valley of the Thousand Blossoms had been a jewel of Ionia for as long as memory could stretch. Rivers from the high mountains threaded together there, their waters feeding terraces of cherry trees that bloomed in every season. Pilgrims had once carried offerings to the shrine at its center. Monks had turned prayer wheels that spun the wind into harmony, and the air had been heavy not with smoke, but with petals. It was a place where balance could be felt in every sound, where children laughed beneath the trees and old men came to end their lives in peace. But when LEESIN arrived at the ridge overlooking that valley, he heard none of these things. He heard the rhythm of boots trampling blossoms. He smelled iron and the acrid sting of oil. He felt the dissonance of too many voices shouting in victory songs that belonged to conquerors, not keepers. The shrine below was shrouded in banners of black and crimson, its gates lined with soldiers, its courtyards turned into a camp for war. He stood still, letting the air bring him its truth. The dragon within his chest stirred immediately, its fire rising like a tide against the cage of his ribs. "Look at them," it whispered. "Steel desecrates sacred ground. One blaze and they are ash. One blaze and the blossoms are avenged." His breath deepened, steady but heavy, as though the mountain itself leaned against his shoulders. He tightened the red cloth across his eyes and began his descent, each step measured against the weight of temptation. When he reached the foot of the steps, the Noxian commander was already waiting. The man's armor was blackened steel, jagged with spikes, his voice gravel dragged across stone. "Blind monk," he sneered. "You have come too late. This valley is ours. Leave or burn." Soldiers laughed, their voices sharp, blades rasping from scabbards. They thought him a lone wanderer, an easy target. They had heard whispers of him, perhaps, but legends are easy to laugh at until they walk into your camp. LEESIN bowed his head, staff grounded in dirt. "This ground belongs to balance, not conquest. Leave now and the blossoms will forgive you." Their laughter rolled like thunder, cruel and confident. The first wave of soldiers charged. LEESIN moved, and the valley itself seemed to breathe with him. His staff cracked against a shield, splitting the rhythm of their charge. He pivoted, listening to the air tear before each strike, hearing the shift of weight, the rasp of armor, the sharp intake of breath before a thrust. Each sound was a map, and he moved along it with precision. A spear lunged. He twisted aside and struck its haft, sending it into its wielder's chest. A blade whistled toward his head. He ducked low, sweeping the legs of its owner with a sweep of staff. Soldiers fell one after another, weapons clattering like rain on stone. But for every man who dropped, two more pressed forward. The camp roared with the rhythm of an army, not a band of raiders. Boots stomped in cadence, shields clanged, and the weight of numbers pressed in. Steel grazed his shoulder, warm blood trickled down his arm. His breath grew harder. The dragon inside him surged, its fire a furnace, pressing to be released. "End it now," it whispered. "One blaze, and all of this ends." For a heartbeat, he nearly surrendered. He remembered the courtyard of Shojin aflame, his master's scream, the scent of burned stone. He remembered the exile that had followed, the endless years of silence and shame. The memory pressed down like a storm, threatening to break the fragile balance he had built. He almost let the fire loose, but then another memory rose to meet it. Udir's voice in the snow, steady as the earth, power as service, and his own mantra, whispered so many nights into silence. "I am not the flame, I am the vessel." He exhaled, the fire within him did not vanish. It settled, balanced, no longer demanding but waiting. His movements changed. He no longer struck to overwhelm but to redirect. A blade came screaming toward his ribs. He stepped just aside, catching its rhythm, letting it pass harmlessly, while his staff pressed its wielder to the ground. A spear darted toward him. He did not clash, but turned, shifting its force back into its owner's chest. He was horizon rather than storm, steady rather than furious, unshaken rather than wild. Soldiers faltered, their rhythm broken, their confidence unraveling, as they realized this man could not be worn down. The commander bellowed, charging with a great sword heavy enough to cleave a tree. LEESIN listened to the blade's song as it split the air. At the last instant he turned, planting his staff and pressing his palm into the man's chest. The blow staggered, but did not destroy. He could have unleashed the fire and ended it with one strike, but instead he chose mercy. He grounded his staff between them. "Leave," he said, breath heavy but voice calm. "This place will not yield." The commander roared again, pride hotter than courage. But when he raised his blade, no soldier followed. Fear had crept through them, where arrogance had been. Their formation dissolved. One by one they pulled back, dragging their leader with them, until the valley fell silent. Only the blossoms remained, trembling in the wind but unbroken. From the forests, villagers emerged. Their steps were hesitant at first, then quick with relief. They carried garlands of blossoms, pressing foreheads to the dirt, voices rising in gratitude. "Savior," they whispered. "Guardian." LEESIN lifted his hand. "Do not kneel, rise. This temple lives not because of me, but because of you. Guard it not with fear, but with reverence." That night, incense smoke curled once more through the shrine's halls. Villagers rebuilt prayer wheels, lit lanterns, restored the sound of bells to the valley. LEESIN sat apart, beneath cherry trees, whose blossoms drifted across his shoulders like snow. He bowed his head and listened, not only to the laughter of children and the crackle of lantern fire, but to the dragon within him. It pulsed steady, no longer raging, no longer demanding, only present. He understood at last that balance was not a state to be achieved once and forever, but a choice renewed in every heartbeat. Each trial, each temptation, each whisper of fire would come again, and he would have to choose again. When dawn came, he rose. The cloth across his eyes tightened, his staff tapped against stone, and he stepped onto the endless road. Behind him the blossoms swayed, their fragrance carried by the morning wind, reminding him that sacred places endure only when discipline endures with them. He was not savior, not saint. He was reminder, and reminders do not fade. They walk, steady as breath, eternal as the road itself. Chapter 15. The teacher and the flame Shojin had always been a place of training, where novices bruised their knuckles on wooden posts and learned to tame their breath before their fists. But when LEESIN returned after months upon the roads, he found that the monastery had changed. His presence had left an imprint deeper than he realized. Initiates no longer measured themselves only by strength or precision. They whispered instead of patience, of listening, of restraint. Some had begun to wear strips of red cloth tied at their wrists, not in imitation but in quiet respect for the lesson he embodied. The elders asked him to teach. At first he hesitated. Teaching, he thought, required authority. He still carried too much failure in his chest, too many scars to call himself master. But the elders insisted that scars themselves could be teachers, that his very brokenness was the vessel for wisdom. And so, reluctantly, he accepted. The courtyard became his classroom. Young monks gathered in a circle, staffs laid across their knees, eyes bright with the eagerness of youth. LEESIN stood before them, staff in hand, blindfold firm across his ruined eyes. His first lesson was not in striking. It was in silence. Before you can strike, he told them, you must listen. Not only with your ears, but with your skin, your breath, your heart. A fight is a conversation. If you speak without listening, you shout into emptiness. At first the students laughed nervously, unsure how to train without motion. But he led them through breathing exercises, teaching them to notice the space between inhalation and exhalation, to hear the sound of their robes shifting against their skin, to feel the subtle vibrations of others moving near them. Some grew restless, impatient to fight. LEESIN let their impatience burn itself out like kindling. Discipline, he reminded himself, was not taught in a single morning. When sparring began, he forbade the students to use their eyes. Blindfolds were tied across their faces, and panic immediately followed. Their strikes were wild, their movements clumsy. LEESIN moved among them like a tide, tapping their staffs aside with gentle precision, correcting their stances with the brush of his palm. You fear blindness, he told them, but blindness is truth. Sight distracts you with illusions of surface. Without it, you must feel essence. You must hear intent before it becomes action. Weeks passed. Some students grew frustrated, tempted to quit, but those who endured began to change. Their movements slowed, then steadied, then sharpened. They struck not from desperation, but from rhythm, guided by listening rather than seeing. They began to sense one another's presence without eyes, to anticipate strikes by breath and weight. And when LEESIN sparred them, he no longer found flailing novices but growing monks who could meet him, however briefly, with clarity. Yet teaching was not only in motion. In evenings, beneath lantern light, he told them stories, not of victory, but of failure. He spoke of the courtyard where his pride had crippled his master, of the fire that had blinded him, of the exile that had nearly broken him. The students listened in silence, eyes wide, hearing perhaps for the first time that strength could destroy as easily as it could defend. Do not worship power, he told them. Honor it, serve with it. The dragon within you is not meant to be leashed nor unleashed, but understood. To fight is to serve is to balance. Still, the fire within him remained restless. Some nights, when the students had gone to their chambers, he sat alone in meditation. He felt the dragon coil, its warmth pressing against his chest. It whispered of swifter ways, of battles that could be ended with a single blaze. He did not ignore it. He bowed to it, breathed with it, and let it pass. Teaching others reminded him daily that discipline was not perfection. It was practice, renewed every dawn. One day, a group of villagers arrived at Shojin's gates. They carried a boy no older than 12, his body trembling with fever, his mind broken by what he had seen. Their village had been attacked by deserters, and the boy alone had survived. The villagers begged the monks to help him. The healers tended his body, but his spirit remained trapped in terror. He woke screaming each night, fists clenched, breath ragged. The elders asked LEESIN to try. LEESIN sat with the boy in the quiet of the courtyard. He spoke softly, guiding him through breathing, showing him how to listen to his own heartbeat. At first the boy resisted, fear too deep for words. But slowly, over days, he calmed, his breath steadied. He began to rise from his mat, to move in simple stances, to feel strength return to his limbs. LEESIN taught him not to strike, but to balance, to stand, to breathe. And in time, the boy laughed again. A sound fragile but real. The novices saw this and understood. Strength was not always measured in the clash of staffs or the bruises of sparring. Sometimes it was in the ability to sit beside another's suffering and share stillness. Power was not only the fire of the dragon, but the warmth of presence. As months turned, LEESIN grew into the role of teacher. The students respected him not because he was invincible, but because he was honest. He did not hide his scars, nor the fire that still tested him. He told them openly, "I am not finished. I am always learning. Discipline does not end." The humility of that truth made his lessons heavier than any boast. But the world beyond Shojin still called. Noxian banners had not vanished. Sacred places still trembled. LEESIN knew he could not remain within the walls forever. He would leave again, as he always did. Yet this time he would not walk alone. His students, still young but growing, would carry his lessons into every step they took. His fire, balanced by discipline, would not end with him. On the night before his next departure, he stood in the courtyard as the lanterns burned low. The novices gathered, their faces lit with both sorrow and pride. LEESIN bowed deeply to them. "I was once blind long before I lost my sight," he said, "but now I see more clearly than ever. Remember this, the dragon is not your master. You are not its cage, you are its host. Serve it with balance, and you will never lose yourselves." The bells of Shojin rang again at dawn. LEESIN tightened the red cloth across his eyes, planted his staff against the ground, and stepped onto the road once more. Behind him, his students bowed, their breath steady, their discipline intact. Ahead, the path stretched into endless horizon. The blind monk walked forward, not only as guardian, but now as teacher. And wherever his steps carried him, Shojin carried on, not as walls of stone, but as lessons breathed into the hearts of those who followed. Chapter 16, The Eternal Guardian. The road was never meant to end, and LEESIN had long accepted that. From mountain shrines to river valleys, from frozen ridges where the wind screamed to bamboo groves where silence breathed, he had carried the same rhythm. Step, breath, strike when needed, bow when done. He was not chasing glory, nor fleeing failure anymore. He was walking because the road itself was discipline, and discipline never finished. By now his name had become larger than any step he took. Children told each other tales of the blind monk, who could hear the heartbeat of an army and strike its leader before the first arrow flew. Priestess repeated his story as parable of the boy who burned, the exile who wandered, the guardian who chose stillness over fire. In markets and inns, his name was a thread tying strangers together, each version more exaggerated than the last. Some called him saint, others demon, but all agreed on one thing: LEESIN was eternal. He never argued with the stories. He knew they were only half-truths dressed in blossoms. What mattered was not whether people knew his scars, but whether they remembered the lesson. He had lived too long with fire coiled in his chest to care about fame. What mattered was the next village, the next shrine, the next moment where sacredness trembled and discipline was needed. It was in the coastal province of Shojin that his last great trial came. Rumors had spread of Noxian warbands returning, carrying with them machines that belched fire hotter than dragons and shattered stone with ease. Entire hamlets fled before their march, and the sacred tide shrines of the coast were left unguarded. LEESIN followed the trail of smoke until he reached the cliffs where sea met land in thunderous waves. There, a host of Noxians had built camp, their machines looming like iron beasts against the horizon. The dragon stirred within him at the sight. For years it had whispered, sometimes gently, sometimes like a storm rattling the bars of his ribs. Now its voice was louder than ever. "Release me," it urged. "End this in fire. Burn their steel. Save them all." For the first time in many years, LEESIN nearly agreed. He stood at the cliff's edge, the ocean spray wetting his face, listening to the clash of steel below, the shouts of men, the whine of war machines. The fire in his chest surged, rising until he could taste smoke in his throat. He remembered Shojin aflame. He remembered his master's scream. He remembered Udir's voice in the snow. Power is service. And he whispered to himself, as he always had, "I am not the flame. I am the vessel." But this time he did not stop there. He added words he had earned only now, after years of scars and patience. "And the vessel chooses." He descended the cliff path into the heart of the camp. Soldiers jeered at first, but their jeers faltered as they saw the calm with which he walked. The red blindfold glowing faintly in dawn's light. Their commander roared, ordering arrows loosed. The sky darkened. LEESIN inhaled once, deeply, listening not to the fear of those around him, but to the rhythm of the world. And then he moved. He was faster than the eye, but not because of flame. His staff cracked against the ground, sending vibrations that unbalanced archers. His strikes flowed not from anger, but from precision, folding one motion into the next. He used the machine's own weight against them, turning gears and ropes into snares, pulling steel monsters down cliffs into the sea. He did not unleash the dragon in full, but he let it breathe through him in balance. Fire curled faintly at his fists, enough to melt iron chains, enough to scatter enemies, but never enough to consume. The battle stretched from dawn to dusk. By the end, the Noxian host had broken, their machines ruined, their banners torn. Survivors fled, stumbling across sand blackened not by fire but by effort, by discipline. Villagers returned from the forests to find the shrines standing, the cliffs unbroken, the sea still singing. They knelt before him, but LEESIN only raised his hand. "Rise," he said. "Sacredness is not guarded by me alone. It lives in each of you." That night, alone on the cliffs, he sat in meditation. The dragon's warmth still pulsed in his chest, not demanding, not furious, but steady, like a companion breathing beside him. For the first time, he felt not fear of it, nor the need to restrain it constantly, but a partnership. Fire, and stillness, vessel and flame, each incomplete without the other. He had not silenced the dragon. He had learned to walk with it. Word of the battle spread, gilded by legend, embroidered with impossibilities. Some said he had split the sea. Others swore the dragon itself had descended to fight beside him. LEESIN let the stories grow. He knew they no longer belonged to him. What belonged to him were the steps he had taken, the breaths he had counted, the choice renewed every moment. Not savior, not saint, but reminder. At dawn he rose. The ocean shimmered like hammered bronze, waves chanting against the rocks. He tightened the red cloth over his eyes, lifted his staff, and stepped once more onto the road. There would always be another shrine, another village, another soul in need of reminder. The journey was endless, but so was his vow. LEESIN was no longer the boy who burned, no longer the exile who wandered blind with shame, no longer only the guardian who resisted fire. He was all of these, woven together. He was the blind monk, the eternal guardian. Not because he was invincible, but because he never ceased to choose discipline. And as long as breath remained in his body, the road would continue beneath his feet.